This month, the US government released an exhaustive scientific report on climate change, citing humans as the dominant cause of global warming. So, should we still be optimistic about humanity's ability to combat climate change? Earlier, I spoke with Andrew Friedman, senior science editor at Mashable, and David Wallace-Wells, the author of a controversial New York Magazine article titled The Uninhabitable Earth, which paints a pessimistic doomsday scenario for the planet. I began by asking David why he chose such a fatalistic approach.
My goal was to do a survey of the science's best understanding of worst-case climate scenarios. So what I did was I took the UN's projection for what their median projection for how warm the planet would get without human action to halt emissions, which is about 5 degrees. And I took their projection for the high end of how warm the planet would get by 2100 if we took no action, which was about 8 degrees. And I took that to a series of scientists with specialties in certain subfields and basically asked them what those temperatures would mean for their areas of expertise, what it would mean for agricultural production, what it would mean for heat stress, what it would mean for...
And all the answers were pretty dire, weren't they?
They were, and you know, I want to be clear here, as I think I was in the article, although some of my critics missed it, that what I was presenting was really a absolute worst-case survey, and one of the things I wanted to do was show readers how that spectrum of terrifying possibilities could unfold.
Well, let me put that point to Andrew Friedman. Andrew, you're a science writer who spent more than a decade covering climate change. In your view, what are the odds, the chances of all this, or much of this, actually happening, of the Earth becoming partially uninhabitable by the end of this century, for example, as David has suggested? Or is this, as some of David's critics have suggested, all just climate disaster porn?
You know, it is very unlikely. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. But I would say, you know, and that sort of gets to my central criticism of the piece, and I think what was a lot of people's criticism in the climate community, which is that it didn't really get across the probabilities of the scenario that he was presenting. So I have very little problems with the dire scenarios that he presented, in the sense that here's how they would play out. I don't think that he you know, made fundamental mistakes in how those scenarios might play out. However, the reader comes away from that piece feeling terrified and not understanding really what the likelihood is of those terrifying outcomes versus somewhat less terrifying outcomes,
but Andrew,
or
let me
even
ask you this.
More manageable outcomes.
Andrew, let me ask you this. A lot of people, when they do look at climate science or read stories about climate science, you know, they come away thinking, oh, it's bad because we're going to have rising sea levels, or because we're going to have a bit more extreme weather, a few more hurricanes. What's wrong with simply making the public aware of just how bad things could theoretically get, in your words?
I don't know that there is anything technically, I don't know that there is anything wrong with that. I think you can ask the question of whether or not which approach is more effective in communicating the issue, and what exactly is the value of focusing so much attention in a magazine cover story and thousands of words on the worst case scenario. It's a little bit like if I was doing a TV weather forecast and I said there was a 55% chance of 6 inches of snow, and, you know, a 2% chance that we're going to get 35, 40 inches and have the city crippled for days. And I went on for the entire weather forecast and just talked about the crippling scenario.
I want to come back to Andrew's point that he made about what's the best strategy for changing people's minds. I want to come back to that in a moment. Before I do, just on your piece, there was a flurry of articles, David, and responses from respected climate scientists criticizing your approach and even some of the science behind it. For example, the very well-known climatologist Michael Mann co-wrote a piece critiquing your essay entitled "Doomsday Scenarios Are as Harmful as Climate Change Denial." And he argued that the science reporting in your piece was undermined by exaggerations, even inaccuracies. What's your response to him?
Well, I think there are basically two issues. One is on the sort of narrow question of the scientific validity of the piece. I appreciate Andrew said earlier he doesn't take any major issues with that. That's my position. Then there's the kind of bigger question of what sort of writing about climate terrors is responsible or productive in terms of raising alarm about climate change. It just doesn't seem plausible to me to look at the public and their understanding of climate change and say that climate fatalism is a bigger problem than climate complacency. I think that while it's true that in the ranks of advocates there's the problem of burnout and people do drop out and get discouraged, I think when you look at the public as a whole, it's just very, very clear to me, and honestly I don't see a counter-argument, that the public is not alarmed enough about what is possible and not motivated enough by that alarm to take public political action.
Andrew, do you want to respond to that?
You know, is climate change fatalism a bigger problem than climate complacency? I think they're both big problems. Neither one of them is necessarily a solution. I would prefer like climate change realism here. You know, the debate in the scientific community is between this is going to be quite bad, manageable in some ways but unmanageable in others, versus this is going to be very, very bad. There is very little discussion of we can limit this to extremely low levels where we're not really going to have to readjust our society.
But Andrew, you've written, I've yet to meet a pessimistic climate scientist. Isn't that part of the problem, that scientists are either too cautious or maybe even too complacent, and therefore they're not the best communicators of this? You do need someone like David to come along and shake things up.
You know, I think that's not a bad argument. I think that, you know, regardless, I was torn about this piece in some ways because I read it and I reacted to it in a piece that I wrote, and then I watched all the other discussions pour in. And there were so many valid points being made. And I think that climate scientists in general tend to be terrible messengers about their work. There are some that excel at it, but too many of them talk about uncertainties before they talk about more confident conclusions.
Okay.
And I think that can be a drag on the public debate sometimes.
And just to pick up on that for one quick second, the question of uncertainties is really important. You know, Andrew mentioned earlier that my piece didn't have any probabilities in it, which is true, and you know, I would have liked to include them. One issue with coming up with them is just that there's so many uncertainties baked into all of our climate models, but also our understanding of what kinds of action humans will take. But we tend to, as a public, as a lay public, we tend to take uncertainty as an excuse for, I would say, complacency, and think that if there are reasons to believe that things may not get as bad as scientists expect, that they will, rather than understanding that that uncertainty works in the other direction too, and they could be considerably worse than scientists expect.
And one last question to both of you. Isn't the problem that the human brain, we're told by lots of scientists, isn't wired to respond effectively to large, slow-moving threats like climate change? We're far more afraid of short-term losses, not long-term losses, not abstract threats. Is there a way that climatologists and science writers such as yourselves can get through to people better, communicate more effectively to make the public wake up and take action on climate change now, while sticking to the facts? Andrew?
Yeah, and I think there are, and I think that we're doing that increasingly with coverage of sea level rise, with coverage of extreme weather events in the context of climate change, telling people, you know, that this particular heat wave that you might be experiencing on a given day will be much more normal in 10 to 20 to 30 years, and here's the science behind that. Really connecting it on a day-to-day steady drumbeat of climate coverage, I think is going to move the needle much more than fatalistic, low probability events, especially when you are ignoring the uncertainties with it. The advocates for, you know, out there on the front lines every day, I think they're going to end up shooting themselves in the foot if they rely on that to try to get people to, you know, go to the voting booth and think about climate change.
David, last word?
I think that there are a huge number of biases in our brains and our psychologies that prevent us from taking action on climate change. One of the ones that I was most focused on in the piece was because the climate messaging has been so focused on sea level rise, most people tend to think that it's something that's going to happen somewhere else to some other people. And one of the main messages of my piece, I hope, was that this is something that's going to touch every human life on the planet in some way or another, and you can't avoid it just by moving a few miles farther away from the shore. And therefore, it's really important that all of us take action on it together.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.